Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Pooky. I'm now a local parent and carer, and one of the gang. So I have two daughters who are currently in year 8, but actually both have just been deregistered from school and are now learning from home because we found it challenging at school. So my daughters are both autistic and one suspected ADHD. So this is a topic very, very close to my own heart, personally, as well as professionally. I'm also autistic and struggle a lot with anxiety as well as other issues. So so there's a lot going on in this talk, and I'll bring a bit of personal experience to the table, as well as the kind of, what the evidence tells us and what the research tells us and so on and so forth. I'm really, really happy if you do have kind of questions or queries throughout, then do feel free to pop them in the chat, and Zoe will highlight to me anything that we need to kind of address as we go through, but otherwise we'll save them for the end. And I'm also really happy if you have questions that go outside of the topic today, if you want to pick those up in the Q&A, and I'll answer as many as I can during that time. And if there's any that I can't, either because of time or it's beyond my expertise, then I'll look to sort of send answers on or links on later. But this morning we're focusing in on anxiety within autism and ADHD. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. You'll get a copy of all these slides. I've put a link in the chat to a copy of the slides and other resources, and I'm sure that Amaze will share them with you too. So without further ado, there will be various points in here as well where I will give you a moment to have a think, and if you want to share, then pop your thoughts in the chat, and often then I'll sort of draw on those and reflect on them as well. And that means that for the people who are watching back the recording, that they get a slightly richer experience, because they won't be able to see the chat other than what I share back. So if you'd like to share any thoughts in the chat, then feel free to do so. So we're thinking about anxiety from the point of view of parents and carers whose children are autistic or who have ADHD, although there are loads of ideas within this that are actually more broadly applicable too. So if you fall outside of that, then I'm hoping there'll be lots in here that you will find of use. So the important thing to remember here from the beginning is that we are alongside our children all the time, and while actually as their parent and carer, what we really want to be able to do is just to do this for them. We want to be able to fix it, make it all better, make it go away, and unfortunately what we can't do is that we can't make it go away. We can't walk their miles for them. But when we learn a bit more about their experience of the world and the things that might make that a little bit more manageable, then there's lots that we can do to walk alongside them in a really constructive and supportive way, whilst empowering them to live their own lives as well. And that's always the tension that we have as parents and carers, particularly when it comes to things like anxiety, because we just want to protect and do and make better. But our children will do best in the medium and the long term when actually we enable and we empower and we help them to build the skills to be able to do some of these things for themselves, albeit with a supportive parent, carer, or other supporting us or adult alongside them, scaffolding that experience. So you can't do it for them, but you can prevent them from doing it alone. So in terms of what we're going to cover in the next sort of hour or so before we go into our sort of Q&A at the end, we're going to think first of all just briefly about why do we see anxiety so much in our neurodivergent children? Why is it that children, particularly those who have ADHD or are autistic, why do we see so much anxiety? What's going on there? Spoiler alert, we don't exactly know the answer, but I've got some ideas to share on this, and a couple of soapbox moments for you as well. Then we're going to think about the anxiety cycle and why it perpetuates and how we can think about starting to break that. So that will be particularly helpful for those of you perhaps whose children are really struggling with anxiety, and we can experience their world getting smaller and smaller because the anxiety seems to spread from one thing to another. And we can find, we'll get to a point with some children where they feel so anxious they might barely kind of interact with other people, or might not feel confident to kind of go much further than their room, and their world can get really tiny. So we're looking at breaking that anxiety cycle either before it sets in, or trying to get their world a bit bigger again. Well, think about how we can get anxiety out. So when we feel like the coiled spring and we've got all sorts going on, what we can do to actually work through that, and a few practical suggestions there, and there are more in the resources as well as then thinking how your child can take some steps to actually take control of their anxiety kind of day to day. What are the things that they can be doing to help them to manage their anxiety in a neurotypical world? We then build on that with a few self-soothe skills. These are really simple things and just some practical ideas for you to take away. And then we finally will have a little bit of a think about self-talk and the things that we say to ourselves and how we say them, and how that internal dialogue, which is the voice we hear all the time, can have a really big impact, and how we might want to try and change a little bit what that sounds like. That bit can feel a little uncomfortable for us as parents and carers, because we're thinking about this through the lens of our children. But when we start thinking about self-talk, we often find that the way that we talk to ourselves as adults isn't always very kind either. And we might want to think about what we're role modeling for our children as well. So that's kind of roughly where we're going to go in the next hour. So hopefully that's kind of the sorts of things that you thought we might cover. But as I've discussed with Zoe and the team before, I've got about a million different directions we could have taken this morning. And if there are particular ones that you'd like in the future and you find the learning helpful today, then do let the team know. And I'm more than happy for us to look at other topics in the future. So we're going to start with why. Why do we see so much comorbidity, is the technical term, which is when we see things alongside each other, both at the same time, anxiety and autism, or ADHD, or autism and ADHD, because plenty have both of those things comorbid. Why does this happen? So the kind of medical research underpinning here is saying that it's not really down to any one thing. We talk about what's called a biopsychosocial model. And don't worry, I'm not going to spend hours talking about the science, but just understanding this a little bit, and that it's kind of complex, is, I think, helpful background. So the biopsychosocial model says that we've got various different things that make up how we are and who we are and what's going on for us. So we've got the biological bit, the bio. So that's our genetic makeup, what we're kind of, what we're born with, our genes, how we were going to turn out based on our parentage. We've got the psychological bit, our thoughts, our feeling, our behaviors, our sort of experience in the world, essentially. So the environmental factors, that kind of sort of nurtury bit. And then there's the social bit, which is our sort of more like day-to-day experience. So it's always a little bit hard, I have to say, when we're looking at biopsychosocial, actually unpicking what's social, what's psychological. But it's that whole nature nurture thing. And the crux of it is, it's complicated. There's a lot going on. And when it comes to anxiety specifically within children who are autistic or have ADHD, this is a very, very live question. Is it that when you have the kind of chemical and biological makeup, that means that you are going to present with ADHD or autism? Is there something about that makeup that means that you will also be anxious? Or is it to do with the lived environment that you're in, or the feedback that you're getting from other people in response to your condition that means that you might be more anxious? So, for example, I know that for myself, one of the things that makes me very anxious is big social situations. And that, I think, is because I'm a neurodivergent person living in a neurotypical world. When I go to big social situations, I'm always trying to guess, what is this person trying to tell me through their body language? And it's quite complex for me trying to figure that out. And did I say and do the right thing? Do they think I'm being rude? Did I hold my face in the right way? Because I know I don't always do that. There's so many questions going on and so much to think about, that this is quite a kind of high stress situation for me, like spinning many, many plates. And so that can make me quite anxious. But if I were in an environment where all the people there were also neurodivergent, and we all think and spoke in similar ways, and I knew that I could use my more natural way of being and be quite blunt and obtuse and all those things, I'd probably feel a lot less nervous about it, and that anxiety would reduce. So perhaps some of the anxiety comes from being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. Likewise, there are other things like lots and lots of sounds and lots of smells and lots of things which are visually overstimulating that can mean that we can feel quite uptight. So there's quite a lot going on in the world that can make it tricky for us. So the thing I think it's important to understand here is that anxiety we see it all the time, and it's almost, I mean, it had traditionally been part of the diagnostic criteria when it comes to autism and ADHD, but it's not now, because actually it shouldn't be an inevitable part of the experience for our children. It feels almost inevitable right now, and in the world that we live in right now, where there's still so much learning to do and so much progress that needs to be made to make the world feel more comfortable for those of us who are neurodivergent, but it shouldn't be inevitable. And this may be something that you observe in your home environment versus, for example, the school environment, where you have less control. You may find that your child is much less anxious when they are in their home, where perhaps you have managed things and you've thought very carefully about how things feel and what they look like and what sounds are there, and your child might wear comfortable clothes that aren't making them feel uptight, and they're interacting with people who get them. And in that environment, you might find that your child's anxiety is much lower, whereas perhaps at school or in other settings that are less familiar or have other stimuli which feel more challenging for various reasons, that perhaps that anxiety is higher. And if everywhere could feel more like these kind of nurturing, kind, calm environments that we work hard to create for our children, then perhaps that anxiety would be generally lowered. So that's a dream. That's one day when Pooky rules the world. These are the things we would like to see. That's not the world as we know it right now. So the thing here to acknowledge is anxiety is not inevitable. It is very likely if our children go out and interact with the world, but we can create little cocoons of safety and comfort, and we can look at how there can be adjustments made in order to reduce that anxiety. So it's not inevitable. And I do think that's really important to note. There may be some biological predisposition. It may be more likely. There may be something genetically going on there linking the two. But so much of what we see, and when people reflect on their experience, is a result of trying to live normally in a world that's not set up for us. So just taking a little example here of what this might look like for a particular person. So yeah, this is Jenny. So Jenny's got ADHD. So in terms of her biology, going back to this biopsychosocial model, Jenny's got ADHD. That's her genetic makeup and her predisposition. So that's the bit that's there. Psychologically, so she is a kid who's really creative. She's really kind. She's very sensitive, and she struggles with emotional regulation and problem solving. So that's kind of how she is within the world, how she thinks and feels and behaves. So, you know, she might sound like a child that you work with or care for. So there's a lot going on for there. She's a deep child. She's very sensitive, really creative, fab kid. But socially, in terms of how the world interacts with her, because she's a child with ADHD, she's going to get huge amounts more corrective and negative feedback than her peers. This is something, there's loads and loads of evidence around this, specifically for children who have ADHD, about basically how much they get told off in school, because they're always on the move, they're always bouncing around, or for many of them, this will be the case. They might be impulsive, they might answer questions without putting their hand up in the right way. They are just often doing not exactly the thing that the adult in the room might hope of for them. And so they're getting these little bits of feedback all the time, correcting them or telling them off. And so that's their lived experience often. And not always just at school as well. Sometimes when we, you know, as parents and carers, I have to work really hard not to do this with my own child. I like to think, particularly when one of my daughters is struggling, I try to use unconditional positive regard, which is where we're always looking for the positive. But that's very challenging when you have a child whose behavior means that it might, as an adult, irritate, provoke, distress, worry you, and trying to find the good in that. So when your child's bouncing around all over the place and what you're trying to do is find what's good here, what can I praise, that can be a little bit hard. And so our ADHD children do receive loads more negative feedback. They tend to feel their self-esteem is often a lot lower. They tend to feel that they're failing, that they can't, and that internal narrative can be quite negative as a result. She will sometimes find, Jenny, that she gets left out at playtime. Maybe when she was younger, it was a little bit easier, but as the kids have gotten older, those social interactions do become a little bit more challenging because she just interacts in a slightly different way than her friends. And she wants to get up to different things than her friends. And that's okay and that's fine, but that can feel hard and lonely at playtime. But when she's at home, Jenny feels happy and safe. This is an environment that is more tailored to her needs, where she's able to play the things that feel right for her rather than what's considered cool and stage appropriate by her peers, and where people are used to interacting with her in ways that feel good for her, and where perhaps parents and carers do appreciate her and have a bit more time to think about her as an individual, and perhaps overlook some of her quirks and ways that she manages day to day. So you can see how someone like Jenny has a bit of a different experience of the world as a result of the fact that she has ADHD. So she's getting very, very different input than her neurotypical peer. So I want, just thinking someone like Jenny, or perhaps your own child in mind, just thinking what sort of things, bearing that in mind, our different experience of the world, what sorts of things might trigger anxiety for our children who have ADHD or are autistic. And I'm going to give you 60 seconds just to think about it. And if you want to pop some ideas in the chat, that would be really, really lovely and enrich the session. But if you just want to think about it, that's also fine. Okay, so I'm going to have a little look at the bits that you put. And there's no right or wrong answers. This is really just to kind of get you thinking, really. So trying to fit in, but not knowing how, strangers coming into our home to help and ask questions. So different people feeling different than their peers. That can make people feel very anxious, just that feeling of being different, not fitting in. Being out of control. So, for example, being in an environment that they don't think they can control. I was just going to read that one saying having an unstable connection, but looking forward to seeing the recording. No, that's a tech. Although having an unstable connection, if we perceive that in a different way, that absolutely could result in anxiety. Routine change for myself or a family member, working away a lot and not knowing how long for, and that sort of thing. So yes, we often find that routine and doing things in the same way each day makes things feel safer and easier for us and reduces that anxiety. So when that routine changes, or we can't predict what's going to go on, or there's uncertainty, that can be really, really challenging. So changes of routine. The lunch hall, cover teachers, yes, supply teachers, cover teachers are a really challenging thing. That change in person can be so hard for our kids. They might have got the hang of what's expected of them and how to interact with a particular teacher, and then that teacher's not there one day. That can be tricky. Timed assessments, volume of people in corridors and changing lessons, the movement, the noise between lessons is very anxiety provoking for some of our children. New classes, so anything where we're changing situations can be challenging. For my son, not being at school during the holidays is a source of anxiety. And again, that's that change in routine. If school is a place where actually we feel confident and happy and we know what to expect and we belong and we can succeed, that can be a really positive experience for some. Lots of people talking about noise. So that kind of sensory overwhelm generally can be super, super challenging. So loads and loads of different ideas in here when things change, the world being different, the world being loud and overwhelming. And yeah, you've kind of come up with all sorts of different things, which are on here, and some which weren't as well. So This is the experience for our kids, and it's no wonder that sometimes they get a little anxious. So all the noise, getting told off again and again and again, being left out or teased, and that feeling of being different, not understanding what's going on. So for many of our autistic and ADHD children, they will have issues with what's called executive function, which is how we are able to organize, process, and plan. And if we find those things like organizing, processing, and planning hard, then actually it can be difficult to understand what's expected of us in class and to get on and do those things. And this can lead not just to anxiety, but to frustration, because some of our kids are super bright, and given the right circumstances and enough time and an explanation that they can hear, they're really able to get on with the work. But sometimes in the pressured environment of a classroom and the speed at which things happen, and perhaps with not quite that clarity of explanation, that child may not either be able to understand what's expected of them or to get the task done. And so they can't demonstrate the brilliant stuff that might be happening in their head. And that can provoke anxiety because they feel like they're failing, and it can just be really frustrating, and it can lead to a less great experience in school. And it's one of the things I often explore with teachers, how we support children who struggle with their executive function. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong things, that can provoke anxiety because we get told off for it a lot, and that's a very common experience, again, for our children who struggle with their executive function. And anything where we've got unexpected change or saying the wrong thing. Essentially, there's a whole heap going on that might provoke that anxiety, as you picked out in the chat there. Now, what happens is this creates the anxiety cycle. So we have something like any of those many things that you listed or that I mentioned, which will provoke some anxiety. So it starts off as a little worry and a little kind of niggle, and things don't feel too great. And what we tend to do, human nature says, when that thing happens and it doesn't feel really good, I'm actually just not going to go there. I'm going to avoid it because I'd rather avoid it than feel that horrible feeling again. My tummy went a bit upside down, my breathing went a bit fast, I felt horrible inside and I didn't like it. So why would I go near that thing again? So we tend to avoid the things, the triggers, the stimuli that provoke that horrible anxious feeling. That's a perfectly normal and natural thing to do, and evolutionarily made a lot of sense. Now, when we do that, actually, we feel a little bit better because we're not near the thing that made us feel horrible, which is fantastic. Except if the stimuli, the thing that caused that anxiety, is something we're going to need to encounter and we're going to come across again and again and again, and we can't avoid it forever, then what happens is that anxiety will grow each time we kind of avoid it, because each time we avoid that situation. So for example, if you have a child who's very anxious about going to school, if they avoid going to school, if they don't attend at all, she says, having fully withdrawn her children from school, aware of the irony klaxon here, but we did try for a long time. If they avoid going to school, then what happens is their brain says, well, thank heavens we avoided that horrible situation. All the awful things would have happened. It would have felt horrible, terrible, terrible things would have happened. The brain is very imaginative and will dream up all sorts of nasty scenarios of what would have happened if we'd have done the thing that scares us. Now, that makes that anxiety get bigger and bigger because all we've got is the stories that our brain is telling us about what would have happened. And that happens on a very subconscious level. But essentially, the more that we avoid something, the bigger that anxiety gets. And we end up going round and around and around in this cycle. We'll talk in a little bit about how we break the cycle, but, spoiler alert, essentially what we need are positive or neutral experiences of the fear stimuli. So it's about going to school and realizing it might not be unicorns and rainbows, but nothing really awful happened. And actually then that helps to shrink that anxiety. So we'll talk more about that later and how it can go wrong and what we do about it. But this is how the anxiety cycle perpetuates. And this is why our worlds get smaller and smaller and smaller, because if we learn that when we avoid the thing, we feel a little bit better, then actually each time something makes us feel uncomfortable in that way, we start avoiding it. So we might start with avoiding putting our hand up in class, and then we start avoiding going to that class, and then we start avoiding going to school, and then we start avoiding going out the house, and then we start avoiding going out of our room. And it's not quite that simple and that linear, but that's kind of how it happens. The world gets smaller and smaller as our anxiety grows and engulfs us. So it's really important, if we can, that we understand that cycle and we do what we can as parents and carers to support it. So we're going to think about breaking the cycle later. But first of all, we're going to think a little bit about kind of prevention and what a neurodiverse friendly environment would look like. So to try and prevent that cycle creating in the first place. So we're going to have less of those anxious inputs. So our neurodiverse friendly environment, I love a bit of alliteration. You'll learn about this if you follow my work. I think we need 3 C's, and lots of the literature sort of suggests these similar things, and lots of the work that I do with children and young people who tell me what works for them suggests that these 3 things make a big difference. So we want calm, we want consistency, and we want clear communication that we can understand. So I'll just share a few ideas of what that actually looks like in practice, but this is quite simple stuff. Lots of it you'll probably already be doing, but there may be some bits to cherry pick here, or things to share with other people who work with or care for your child as well. So in terms of creating that calm environment, things that we can try, just actually taking a look around your home and where your child spends their time and making sure it's not too overwhelming. In particular, actually thinking about the spaces that your child seeks refuge in and making sure that those spaces are really, really nice, and work for them in terms of calm if that's something they find helpful. Some parents and carers can feel like, you know, you look at all the Instagram and social media and everyone else is doing all the like beautiful decals and making amazing, beautiful scenes for their children in their bedrooms. And we feel we should do that too. But maybe we've got a child who does better in a bedroom where the walls are painted completely plain white. And that is what feels good for them. And that is what makes them feel happy. It might be that you have zones. So this is something I always encourage in schools, particularly in our primary schools. We have some really amazing, imaginative staff who want to create amazing displays, and they will really help some of our children, but some of our children need that kind of more neutral environment. So we might have little zones where it is calmer that we can go to, where there's less of that input. One of the complicating factors here, because there's always a complicating factor, if your child has ADHD, sometimes they're going to need that calming environment, that plain white, that moving away from it all, making it nice and calm. Other times, they're actually going to need activating and stimulating. And that's where sometimes like bright colors and fun and lots going on in the environment is exactly what they need. And they might move between those 2 things. That's true somewhat for some autistic kids too, but just to be aware, it's not a kind of all the time, everything should be calm and that's always going to be the answer, more so for our autistic kids. But ADHD will swing between the 2, and you'll get to know that as a parent when your child needs calming and actually sometimes when they need activating. And again, if that's a topic we wanted to dig deeper into another time, I'd be more than happy to. But yeah, have a look around at your decor and make sure that it's relatively calming, or that there are at least places where one could go to seek a bit of refuge. Then you might create nooks or safe spaces. So this is about what's called containment. Sometimes we just want to make our world feel smaller because then we can manage it better. This is why children will put their hoods up and why they will seek small spaces that they can hide in. So many of our kids will love a small, often quite dark space to go and hide in, and that might be a nook. We'll find sometimes they like to climb under beds or into cupboards, or you might have a little tent somewhere, or you know, that sort of thing. And this might seem to other people who don't know your child like a slightly odd behavior, or a bit like their Harry Potter in the cupboard under the stairs. But if this was what works for them, making their world smaller so it's manageable until they feel safe to come out again, then this is a perfectly good thing to do. And we might think about where might that space be and how can we make it really, really calm and comfortable for them. And then the other thing in terms of creating that calm environment for our child, it's also about us being calm. And one of the best things to help a child to calm is a calm adult. So us thinking about the things that will help us as adults to emotionally regulate make a big difference. And I find the most helpful thing of all is just remembering every now and then to take a breath. So sometimes as a parent, as a carer, we will feel our anxiety rising or our anger rising or other emotional dysregulation kicking in. And I personally find one of the most helpful things to do in that instance is literally to step away, to turn away, to take a deep centering breath. I'll often give myself a talking to and saying, come on, Pooky, you absolutely can do this. Or your daughter needs you to be calm right now, and stepping outside of myself, almost talking to yourself in the third person in that way. So come on, Pooky, actually addressing yourself. Again, there's very interesting evidence around how helpful that can be in helping you click into the behavior that you need to overcome your own internal mental chatter. So that can be helpful, but essentially trying yourself to be calm. So creating that calm environment. Consistency. Our neurodivergent kids love boring in a good way. They want to know what to expect from us. Ways we can do this as parents and carers, just being really, really clear about what we're expecting from our children. So they know when they've done the right thing. Most kids want to be good. They don't want to get it wrong, but they can't be good if they don't know what good looks like. So let's be really, really clear in our rules and our expectations. And they might look really different than the rules and expectations that we have of our other children or that other families have of their children. It's up to you what your rules and your expectations are within your family. Maybe you're a family that when you're eating meals, someone's allowed to be on their tablet at the table because that is what allows them to engage with their food. And that's how it is in your family. And maybe other family members or other families don't think that's right. It's what's right for you and your family. But be clear so your children know what to expect and when they're getting it right and what they can expect of you. Consistency in terms of what happens at different parts of the day. So routine and kind of rituals can be really nice. So you might have some bits that just always happen in the same way. So there might be things around the morning routine, around drop off, around bath time or bedtime, just picking bits in the day where they can happen in a sort of quite a regimented kind of way, really. Knowing exactly what to expect feels good for us and really takes away the anxiety of the unknown. And this kind of builds on that, really introducing sort of daily rituals, particularly if there are moments, transitions in the day that your child finds quite anxiety provoking, and often like school drop off may be one of those. Actually having a particular way that you do that, you might introduce particular words you say or a little song that you sing or a little handshake that you have. It's up to you, but having little rituals are really kind of bonding and we know what to expect, and it helps to just reduce that anxiety. So consistency, doing similar things in a similar way. And where your child is finding something hard, when we do it the same way each day, again and again and again, that hard thing will begin to feel easier. Because if we do things in a similar way, then we habituate, is the word. Our anxiety will come down because we kind of get more used to doing it in that way. So again, particularly if you've got certain situations, places, things, people that provoke anxiety, having some rituals around how we enter into those activities can really help. And I think that the other thing to say there is we should work out what battles we want to pick. So, for example, if you've got a child, and many of us will do, who has a really limited diet, you might choose just to allow them to eat the same thing every day in their school packed lunchbox because perhaps they've got so much else going on at school that this is not the place where you want to start messing with what you're expecting them to eat. So they might have that ritual of similar food each day. That's a part in the day they'll feel more in control of, more able to manage, and exploring other foods might happen outside of those times. You'd rather they ate something and felt comfortable than didn't. And again, food's a whole nother topic again. And then communication. Now, the thing to remember with communication is it's not about what we say, it's about what our children hear. And we need to check in on that regularly. What are they hearing rather than what are we saying? Because those are two very different things sometimes. So in terms of what our kids need from us, they need us to say what we'll do and do what we'll say. It's as simple as that and as complicated as that. They need to know that we're going to follow through on the things that we've said that we will do and that we're really, really clear in our communications. They need really simple instructions. So we should give as few instructions and rules as we can. And we should try to make them very, very unambiguous where we can. So it's absolutely crystal clear exactly what's expected. This is not just true for our children. This is true for every child, but our children need it more than others. So if we can, keeping those instructions really, really clear. And if you need to, sometimes this just means thinking a little bit more before we speak and giving one instruction really, really clearly. Our tendency as humans is to kind of just waffle on and keep on putting things in different ways and keep clarifying and trying to explain. We're actually better off just taking a moment to stop and think and saying it once very clearly. Our children will respond better to that because there's less for them to have to process. And then finally, checking for understanding. And this is crucial. We start by repeating what we've said rather than rephrasing. And this is something that we all get wrong all the time. And it makes life a little bit harder for our children. And it's really, no, I was going to say it's really easy to change. It's not, because it's a habit that's hard to break, but it's very easy to know what we should be doing once you know. So the thing here is, if we've given an instruction or made a request or asked a question and we're not sure if our child has understood. We need to check, did you understand that? We say it again in exactly the same way, using the same words, the same phrasing, because sometimes they're just still processing it and they need to hear it again. And we might have it written down in the same way. What we don't do is move straight away, as we so naturally often do, to putting it in a different way, saying, oh, they don't look like they've understood, so I'll find a different way to say that. And before we know it, we might have found 3 or 4 different ways of saying the same thing, trying to be helpful. But what we've actually done for our child is we've given them 3 or 4 different things to try and process, because to them, they all seem different. They're much better off hearing the same thing in the same way 2, 3, 4 times if they need to. And if they don't understand, then we can say, would you like me to phrase that differently? And then if they would like you to, then we look to rephrase it. But first, start always with repeating. Just notice when you're giving instructions if you get that right or not. Most people don't. It's really, really hard to just repeat. It's not what comes naturally, but it can make a really big difference to our children's understanding. And that will reduce anxiety, because when they understand what's expected of them, they can get it right. They get positive feedback. The world is a good and happy place. When they get stuff wrong, then it tends to be more anxiety provoking, both internally and externally. So that's kind of the background and the why, and how we can create a sort of autistic and ADHD more friendly environment where we might see a little bit less anxiety happening. We're going to think next about actually breaking that anxiety cycle. So we're going to revisit what we were looking at a moment ago in terms of that cycle, which we brought up, and remembering that how our tendency as humans is to avoid the things that scare us. But this will mean that the anxiety will grow. Here we go, lovely little circle. I spend far too long creating my visuals. So we're going to avoid those things. And what this does is this is what is going to make that cycle perpetuate. Because the more that we avoid things, then the scarier they seem to us internally, the more we go on to avoid those and other things. So we want to try and break this cycle by avoiding avoidance. That's the key thing here. We want to try and avoid the avoidance. Easier said than done, particularly as a parent or carer who really loves their child and doesn't want to see them distressed. Our natural instinct is, that thing scares you, that thing causes you distress, let's take you away from it. Somebody's got their thing unmuted, but I can't see who. I'll leave that to our hosts. So how are we going to break that cycle? So we're going to avoid that avoidance. So it's just knowing that we're going to do that is the first step, that we know that in order not to have this cycle perpetuate, sometimes we're going to need to expose ourselves to the scary thing. And what that looks like for us as parents and carers is actually about supporting and scaffolding. So thinking about how can we enable our child to do the thing that scares them in a way that feels comfortable for them. And we're going to think about anxiety exposure ladder in a moment, which will give you a framework for this if you're working on a particular thing. So it's about thinking our job here is to enable our child to do the thing that scares them safely, to be right alongside them while they do it, to enable them to see that it's not going to hurt or harm them. We're looking here for neutral experiences. So we'd love it to be positive and all brilliant when they experience these things, but we need to be realistic. And actually a neutral experience is fine in terms of breaking that anxiety cycle. So if they can just be near the thing that scares them and nothing terrible happens, that's good enough for trying not to make this cycle perpetuate. And it's all about taking really tiny steps. So it's not about thinking we can overcome any anxious stimuli really, really quickly. This is about thinking, what's the next tiny step that I might take? So for example, if I had a child who had not been to school for 6 months and school was a massive anxiety stimulus for them, I wouldn't be thinking about, well, how am I going to get them back into school 5 days a week or even 3 days a week? I would be thinking first about, like, can I go and drive past the school at the weekend when it's quiet with them? Is that something they feel that they could manage? So I'd be looking at those tiny steps. And those can be built into what's called an anxiety exposure ladder. This is a resource that's linked to in the blog post that I shared, and you can download and use if you want to. So what happens here is that you think of what you're trying to get to, what's your aim with your child. So your child might be wanting to go to school, they might be wanting to stroke their grandma's dog, I think is the example that I'll share in a moment. But it's a thing that's motivated by your child, and it needs to be a really concrete aim. We need to know specifically what it is that we're aiming for if we're going to use this kind of ladder approach of tiny steps. We're then going to break it down into as many steps as we need to. So the sheet that I've created only has a few, but you could have dozens of steps if you needed to. And it might be that you have incremental aims that get you towards a bigger one. You break it down as many as you want to. The aim should always be that the next step feels very possible to a child. Then what happens is, once you've kind of worked out what the steps might be to get towards your aim, then the child actually rates each of those in terms of 1 to 10 in terms of how scary it is. So like a 0 or 1 rating would be that it's absolutely fine, I can do that, I'm not scared at all. And 10 is when it's, you know, so absolutely terrifying that I can even begin to imagine. And what we're looking is to gradually increase that fear rating as we perceive it at the beginning of this, as we go up the ladder until we get to our aim, which is going to be a pretty high fear rating, hence we're trying to overcome it. And in terms of how we move up that ladder, what happens is that for each step on the ladder, we're going to try and stick with that activity, that exposure activity, until that fear rating comes down. So what happens in our body when we're very, very anxious, when we're very, very scared, is that, you know, all those horrible feelings will happen. Our heart might be racing, our stomach might be turning upside down, our breath might go funny, and we just feel it very, very much in our brains and in our bodies. And we might be at an 8, but if we just sit with it and we continue with that exposure to that stimuli, gradually we habituate to that feeling, and that anxiety will begin to reduce as we realize that this thing that triggered that anxiety response isn't actually going to hurt us. As the supporting adult, one of your key jobs here is to make sure that the thing doesn't actually hurt the child. We would never expose them to something which is going to result in a negative experience, or where they might be harmed, because that's going to build the cycle, because the brain will say, told you so, told you this would all go wrong in this way. So we're going to sit with the thing until it feels a bit more possible. The fear rating has come down. So we might start at an 8 or a 7, and it's going to come down as we habituate to something like a 2 or a 3. And then we might feel ready to move on to the next step. We might stick with the same step several times if we feel that we need to. So just an example here, this is, wanting to stroke my grand's dog. So we might think about working up through the steps by reading a story with a dog in it, and looking at pictures of dogs, watching videos of dogs, which might feel a bit scarier, watching Grand's dog from the safety of the upstairs bedroom, and then sitting in the room with Grand's dog on the other side, and then eventually stroking Grand's dog. This might take a day or it might take months, and neither is right or wrong. But the idea is that you take those little steps up through with a supportive adult, and we have no judgment about how quickly we move through them. But this is a very, very accepted way that we can, if a child is motivated to, work towards doing a feared thing. So we've done this recently with one of my daughters, Ellie, who had become very, very fearful of going in the car. And so when I showed her this resource, my children always help to co-produce my resources with me. And she said, I want to do this for going in the car. So we worked out for her what those steps would be. And she was in control of that completely, but with our support, and found it to be really successful, which was really lovely to see. So give you a breath from my voice for a moment, 60 seconds to have a think about what tiny step your child, or a child that you're thinking about, could take on an anxiety ladder to get them towards something that they may wish to do differently or overcome. So what tiny step might a child that you care for, work with, take? I'll give you 60 seconds, and if you want to pop your ideas in the chat, please do. So Lauren says, I find it hard to break it down into small steps as everything seems to be a trigger. I think that's a really fair thing to say. And I think the thing is that maybe we need to think even smaller than you think. So where we're trying to get to is a point where a child says, oh, obviously I can do that. You're looking for that kind of typical adolescent star type response, and that can mean breaking it down so much further than you might imagine. So, you know, for the child who is fearful of going to school, you know, maybe the idea of driving past the school when it was quiet at the weekend, maybe even that feels too much. It might be, I don't know, just looking at pictures of schools online. We're just thinking, what's the smallest possible step we could take? What does feel possible? And what we're trying to do is create what I call I can cycles, because your child will feel very much like they can't, like they're failing. So we're trying to take the tiniest steps that do feel possible to show them that they can. And it doesn't matter how tiny we make those steps, we're trying to show that we can. And each time we do succeed, it can be really helpful to make a record of that. So you might create a poster, or I've known people write it on pebbles in Sharpies, put them in a jar, or my kids love to have them on post-it notes, but something that's a physical reminder of the things that we have succeeded with. Going to school and finding a safe zone or a safe space, perhaps with one friend, with one of them with their choice. Goal setting made fun. Getting up in the morning would be a start. Having a planner they can work with. Design and make fun. So lots of sort of ideas in here. This is hard, and the best thing to do is to think about it with your child and perhaps with other adults who are supporting them. And they do need to feel kind of in control of this. A child is not going to be motivated to do the scary thing because it's hard for them unless they really want to. So this is about thinking about what motivates your child, what would motivate them to want to be able to do this thing. So in our example, that child really wanted to be able to stroke her grand's dog, but it felt very hard because she was very, very scared of dogs. Likewise, if you've got a child, I always come back to the idea of going to school, because so many of us have children who struggle with that. We might have ideas around why it's important for our children to go to school, but those ideas might not resonate with our child, but they might be keen to go because despite all the other challenges, perhaps there's a particular friend that they're missing, or a particular member of staff that they like, or a subject, you know, one subject that they really enjoy, or Lego club on a Tuesday. It doesn't matter what the motivation is and whether it ties in with ours. If it gets us to the same goal, then we can use this to try to encourage them. So next we think about getting it out in our kind of, as we're working through. So this is about when we feel like we've got that anxiety, we need to sort of work it through and get it out. So we're a bit like a sort of coiled spring, if you like, at this point. So we jump around a little bit here just because we want to give you lots and lots of practical strategies to work on with your children. So if we don't get our worries out, they tend to grow heavier and heavier and bigger, and they weigh us down, and they stop us being able to do things day to day. So sometimes we just got to find a way to get those worries out. And I have, again, a little bit of alliteration that can help with this. My strategies all begin with sh. So we can share it. These can be particularly helpful for children at transition moments. So when they're going into school, when they're coming home from school, when they're moving between different activities where they might be carrying their worries with them. So we might share our worries. That doesn't mean we've got to actually talk to someone about them. It might be sharing it in a journal or in our play. It's just getting it out of our head and sharing it with the world. Whether or not another person interacts with that is kind of up to us. So sharing those worries, getting them out. We often talk about name it to tame it. Only when we allow our worries out of our head and we begin to process them are we really in a position to think what next we can do with them. Might shelve it. This can be a really helpful strategy for some of our kids, which is about acknowledging I've got this worry, it's on my mind, it's making me anxious, but right now I want to go and learn about trigonometry. So I'm going to come back to that worry later. I'm going to make an appointment with it. It sounds unlikely, but it does work really, really well. Shout it is about when we're like that coiled spring and we've actually just got to work this out in a big way. So we might be jumping around, screaming into a pillow, running about, making big art, doing something physical often that will help to work that physiological anxiety out, because all that adrenaline coursing around our body can make it really hard to be ready for our next activity. So we might want the chance to get it out, not just by shouting, but through big stuff, and then shed it. So some worries are not our children's worries to carry, and some of our children are really, really deep thinkers, and they carry a lot of other people's worries around with them, the worries of other children, the worries of other adults. And sometimes we need to say, this is not your worry to carry. As an adult who cares about you, I'm going to take that worry away. I'll take that burden and I'm going to go and deal with it. Your child will need to know that you're actually dealing with it, that they can trust you with that worry, that they can really let go of it. But if they know that you're going to deal with it appropriately, often they are very happy to shed those worries and let you carry them instead, because that's our job sometimes. So these are some of the ways that we can get our worries out. And then there are some strategies as well for kind of taking control. And these are things that your children can learn to do for themselves or alongside you as an adult who cares for them. So the thing to understand here is that anxiety can just feel like we're really out of control, like the anxiety is controlling us rather than us controlling it. And so we're trying to flip that. We're trying to take control of our anxiety so we feel like we are driving the ship here rather than our anxiety. And that's what these ideas are all about. So some different ways that we might do this, some different ways that we might take control of our anxiety so we are driving the ship. So grounding strategies. There are loads of grounding strategies. Google it and you'll find ones that work for you. An example of a grounding strategy, a very, very commonly used and loved one, though some people hate it, is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Do not worry about the order of this. Don't get hung up on it, although some people will choose to print something like this or carry it in a lanyard or put it on their phone as a prompt, but it doesn't matter what order you do it in, but you're basically using your senses to engage with the environment you're in right now. And this will take you away from the wider environment that might be causing you worry or from the thoughts in your head. So it's about bringing yourself to this moment right now and really focusing in on your senses. I do one deep cleansing breath rather than one thing you can taste at the end, because often we don't have something to hand to taste and we don't want to go around licking at stuff. Well, maybe we do. I don't tend to. So we tend to take one deep cleansing breath. Breathing strategies. I spoke before about the power of breathing. Breathing is a brilliant thing because when we take control of our breathing, it both tells our brain, no need to panic. This person's in control. Don't press the big red panic button. They've got this. And our body also begins to feel different because we slow things down a bit. Our heart rate will begin to feel different. Our body just starts to feel different. So both body and brain will quickly realize it's okay, we're in control. And so we break that cycle. We stop the panic from setting in. So an example of a breathing strategy, and again, there are loads out there, is box breathing, where we breathe in for the count of 4, we hold it for the count of 4, we breathe out for the count of 4, and we hold it for the count of 4. And we repeat that as many times as we need to. And it's really, really simple. We can talk a child through it. We can do it together. They can draw it as they do it if they want to, what have you. But it's a very, very simple, very easy to remember one. We can flip the feeling. Now, this one takes a little bit more imagination and can be fun to explore with your child. So the idea here is that feelings like feeling scared, anxious can actually be quite similar to feelings like excitement. And sometimes we can get those feelings a bit mixed up and we might want to consciously try and flip that feeling. So we might be saying, I'm really, really scared about going to this new place. But then we might flip that with our child and say, okay, well, you're going to this, I don't know, new place for a party, say. Well, sounds like a nightmare to me. But there might be things about that your child is also excited about. I'm excited to see my friends. I'm excited to try a new thing. And those things do feel physiologically quite similar. So we might try and flip that feeling with them. What are we excited about rather than what are we scared about? Because they kind of feel the same. So we're going to try and zone in to the excitement rather than the scared. And then finally, we can do our if-then planning to try to take control of how we feel. And this is when we think ahead and we think about the things that might go wrong and the things that are worrying us. And we think, well, if that thing does go wrong, then what will I do? And we can plan ahead with our child. And then if things do go wrong, they've got a backup plan and they know what to do because they thought ahead to it. Those of us who are very anxious, often very good in moments of crisis because we've thought through every possible eventuality. So in this example, if my mind goes completely blank when I start the test, then I'm going to count to 10, or I'm going to try my breathing exercises, or I'm going to slowly reread the question. in order to try and get calm enough to access my thinking brain and answer the question. But there are loads of examples here, and you can think it through with your child. Doing if-then planning, people worry about it's going to, validate their worry in a bad way, but actually having a child be able to list out their worries and say, these are the things I'm concerned might happen. Some of them we can say, well, how likely do you think that is? And we can explore that together. But those that are, actually possible and they might happen, being able to say, okay, well, if that does happen, then what will you do? It can be really reassuring for a child because you're validating what they're saying and they feel quite heard, but they do have a plan. So they feel less fearful going into the situation because they know they've thought about the different things that might go wrong and what they'll do next if they do. So I'm worried that at playtime I'll have no one to play with. Okay, well, what could you do then? If that does happen, what would you do? Well, I don't know. I might go to the buddy bench, or I might ask a teacher, or I might approach a friend and I might say X, Y, Z, or I might go and read on my own, or I might. So we're thinking of what we might do in that eventuality. So a few different ideas there. And as I say, you'll get a copy of all of these slides. So don't feel like you have to remember it all, and just cherry pick the bits that feel like they might work. Another set of skills, and there's loads and loads and loads of these available online as well, so a good thing to look up, are your self-soothe skills. So this is about helping us just to get to a place of calm when we are feeling very anxious and we want to make things feel a little bit more manageable day to day. And I wish we didn't need these skills, but again, as neurodivergent people living in a neurotypical world, the world is quite anxiety provoking, and being able to get ourselves to a point of relative calm is really important and helpful and can help us to manage a little bit better day to day. So it can help us manage the ups and downs. Also, this kind of self-soothing, when a child learns that they can change how they feel, that feels like a bit of a superpower and can really give them that sort of sense of agency and control, which is really helpful. And you can also use these as a preventative rather than a reactive strategy if you want to. So if your child knows that they're going into certain places or certain times of day, or there's transition coming up or something that they know sort of triggers their anxiety, then they could proactively do some of these self-soothe skills. So I will do this in my car when I'm about to go and enter a social situation. I'll sit and I'll do my breathing strategies, for example, in the car, to make sure that ahead of a situation that I might really welcome but find very anxiety provoking, I know I'm going in with the best, possible starting point. I've got that baseline really, really solid. So it can be preventative as well as reactive. So a few ideas for self-soothing. Stretching. Stretching can be really, really helpful, can be either sort of energizing or relaxing, depending on where we are, but can just help us to get to a place of good sort of regulation. That might be little stretching, kind of stretching our fingers and things, or it can be great big stretching and things like our yoga stretches and stuff like that. Stretching can be really regulating and can feel really, really good for some of our kids. Soothing music, finding music that calms us and helps us to feel better. A really nice activity, and again, you get links to all of these resources, can be to think with your child about creating playlists that help them to feel calm or help them to feel happy. When we get used to trying to feel calm when listening to a specific piece of music, we can get a bit of a Pavlovian response going on. So that's when our body responds in the same way each time to a certain stimulus. So I love Barber's Adagio for strings. And if I'm feeling anxious, I put that piece of music on and my body instantly begins to calm because I've practiced feeling calm, listening to that music when I'm feeling calm. And my body knows this piece of music calms me down. And literally I start hearing the first few bars and my body responds. It's really cool. And you can do this. You can build these kind of associations with anything. It doesn't have to be music. It might be a taste. It might be that when you chew mint, that you've taught your body, you've done this at times of calm, you've focused on feeling calm. And then in times when you're beginning to feel stressed, you chew mint and your body goes, yes, this taste, this is when I start to feel calm. So you can build that Pavlovian response and game the psychology a little bit. But yeah, having a calming playlist one might turn to, or a particular piece of music, can be helpful. Pointy palms. This is one that I've recently picked up from a great book, which I'll reference at the end. So pointy palms, we put our palms together, fingers firmly pointing up, pressing them together and holding it for the count to 10. You might need to prompt your child to keep breathing. Loads of kids seem to hold their breath. And then we just let go for 2, and then we repeat it. And this is about kind of feeling that sort of deep pressure that can be really helpful. My kids have said that when they do this, they like to think about the energy, like anxious energy shooting up out of the top of their fingers and going away, and almost like a sort of lightsaber type thing. So that visual might help your kids too. But yeah, this is a really, really simple one, but we found to be really effective in our household. Breathing exercises. So we already talked about box breathing, but another one you might try, because I love my breathing strategies, belly breathing. So younger kids particularly love this one. So we put in our hands on our stomach. We're going to close our eyes just so we're focusing on the breathing. We breathe in through our nose. Oh, don't worry too much if you breathe through your mouth. You breathe in really, really, really deep, so your belly gets massive. Little kids love making their belly go massive. And then we're going to breathe out through our nose and feeling our belly deflate. So we're trying to make as much breath coming in and then going out. And this just really helps us to take control of that breathing, to focus in on the breathing, and to be right there with it. Walking is very regulatory, and if in doubt, just get on your feet, get outside, get walking with your child can really, really help. Also good if you've got stressful things to talk about. Walking and talking works incredibly well, and often a lot more success than trying to sort of sit interview style with your child. And then finally, you could put together a bit of a self-soothe box for your child or with your child. This can be a really fun activity to do. So I tend to think about the different senses when putting together a box, which might be something like a shoe box that they might decorate, or any box will do. But you're going to fill it with things that they can go to in moments of higher stress that make them feel good. So we might put things in there that make us happy, that we can look at, pictures, messages, and so on. We might put in there a pair of headphones to prompt us to listen to our favorite playlist, or just a card to remind us to listen to that music. We might put in things that smell really good, things that taste good, or maybe some things that we really like the feel of. So look here, if your child has stims, so particular repetitive activities that they do that feel good for them, try to think how you can put things in the box that represent or encourage those activities, because engaging with our stims can be really, really calming for us. But what goes in the box, again, it's totally up to you and up to your child, and experiment with it, but just create that box and have it as a go-to when we need to calm things down a little bit. Right, we're nearly there. We've got self-talk, and then we're going to go into our questions. So do, if you have your questions, do be asking them. Oh, in fact, first, I'll just give you 60 seconds. I know we're slightly there on time, but 60 seconds to think about what would go into your child's self-soothe box. Just I think collecting a little list of ideas here might be really nice. So what could go into your child's self-soothe box? What would make them feel a little bit calmer? What might look, smell, or feel really good to your kid? One other little aside in terms of the self-soothe boxes is if you've got a child who's struggling with self-harm, having a self-soothe box can be particularly helpful, and always encouraging our children in those moments when they feel the urge to self-harm to try first to access their self-soothe box. So I will often even say to children, you know, if there's a particular item that you normally hurt yourself with, keep it in the box, and so you're going to make a choice, and often then they will get to the point where they're able to make that choice to use a self-regulatory, self-soothing, mood improving activity rather than turning to the self-harm. So what was going to go in your boxes? Soft blankets and familiar smells, Lego, a birthday card from Gran, that's lovely, some jokes, a picture of our pets, and bubble wrap. love bubble wrap. Fidget toys. My daughter has a small candle, which we like, that smells nice. She likes mint tea. That can't go in the box, but the tea bag can, and prompts her to do those things. Absolutely. A smooth stone to stroke. Never underestimate the power of a smooth stone. Absolutely love them. Fidget toys, bubble wrap coming up again. An item of mum's clothing that smells familiar. This is something I've always done for my children when I'm away. I go away for work, and they love to keep my scarves that smell of me, apparently. Yeah, putty, things that we might need. My daughter loves her seashells with different textures, and a calm bottle that we made together. And she's got a lavender mini pillow. And anything to do with foxes, as that's one of his obsessions. I love that. So encouraging, that's another thing we could do with the box, is encourage our child to go into their state of flow and to engage with their areas of kind of hyper focus or special interest. So our special interests, if we have them, if we're lucky enough to have one, are places that often feel really good for us. So when everything else feels really hard in the world, actually going to that happy place and engaging with our special interest can be really, really fab. Another person whose special interest is foxes as well. Love it. Yeah, that's really cool. I'd love to know if other people's what your children's special interests are. I'm really interested in special interest, and also how they can change over time. And I think they're brilliant and a real superpower. I'm writing a book at the moment for autistic and ADHD parents. So not where the children, although often they do, but not about the children being autistic or having ADHD, but the parents do, because it's really hard being an autistic parent. And one of the things one of the chapters I'm going to be exploring is how we can use our special interests and our sort of superpowers and our strengths as a really positive thing, rather than something that we feel that we should hide or get rid of. Okay, and then our final little bit here. So do think about the self-soothe box. They're great fun, really, really good fun to put together, and can be such a lovely tool, to be honest, for your child to go to. And it can give them that sense of sort of agency, having a place that they can go where they can learn. And you can do some of those things together if you want to as well. And we're going to finish off by just thinking a little bit about self-talk, because how we talk to ourselves really, really matters. And it can be heartbreaking to hear how a child talks to themselves. If we don't help to break the cycle, then that kind of self-bullying, it's almost like a form of self-harm, can really erode their self-esteem. So yeah, it is heartbreaking how our children talk to and about themselves sometimes, and we do want to sort of break that. And you might be aware that you do this about yourself too. And one thing we must think about as parents and carers is what we role model in terms of that self-talk. If you are seen by your child to do things like be really negative about your parents, or be unkind to yourself, oh, you're so stupid, I'm so stupid, that kind of thing, we'll say that quite often. Or this kind of, it happens all the time. But when we talk to ourselves like that and about that, then when our children see that, then they think it's okay to talk to ourselves like that. And we don't want our children to beat themselves up and be really nasty to themselves. We want them to appreciate their strengths, to explore and overcome their challenges, but not to just be mean to themselves. We would like them to talk to themselves like they talk to their dog, or like they would talk to a friend, and just be nice, be kind. A helpful thing can be to suggest to a child to imagine what we would say. Would we be mean to you in this situation, like you're being mean to yourself? Would we say something nicer? Or what would your friend say? So the first thing is, with this negative self-talk, is just to notice it, to have your child actually recognize that they're not always very nice in the way that they talk to themselves, to actually tune into some of those thoughts in their head. And then we begin to question it. Is that right? Is it okay that I talk to myself like that? Is it correct? Am I stupid? No, stupid. Mum wouldn't think I was stupid. Dad wouldn't think I was stupid. My teacher wouldn't think I was stupid. My friend wouldn't think I was stupid. So it's not right. There's no evidence to back up this horrible thing that I'm saying about myself. And then we might try to reframe it. So what is something else that I could say to myself? What's something different? What's a different way of exploring this situation? I'm not stupid. I'm learning. I'm learning a new thing and it's hard. I'm not stupid. I've stepped outside my comfort zone and I'm doing something that is harder than I've ever done before. And so I didn't get it right first time. But my teacher would be really proud of me for trying something new today. So how can we reframe what we're saying in our head? And then finally, that idea of just trying to actually treat ourselves as we would treat our friend, be as kind to ourselves as we would be to others. Many of our kids are incredibly kind to other people and can, when prompted sometimes, but can be really brilliant in terms of their compassion, their kindness, their empathy, but not always very kind to themselves. So how can we encourage that kindness to themselves as well? We can also try to replace our negative self-talk with some more positive coping statements. So things that acknowledge our anxiety and our challenges, but actually try to replace them with more positive mantras, if you like, or kind of affirmations. So things like, I'm anxious, but I can manage, or this feeling is going to pass. I've done it before, I can do it again. So there's loads of these, and you might come up with some different ones for your children, but having one or two that you just go to in those moments that are difficult, and we use instead of the nasty stuff that is being said in our head, we go to these phrases instead, can be really helpful. We have to say them many, 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 many times, perhaps, before we start to believe them, but we will eventually start to believe them. The final one there, I choose not to engage with these thoughts. If you have got a slightly older child or one who is quite reflective and quite, able, I guess, this can be a really interesting thing to explore. Like, I'm not going to let my brain rule me. I'm not going to let anxiety control me. I'm choosing not to engage with those horrible things that my brain is saying about me. This can be a really interesting area to explore with your child. Now, if you do start going here with your kid, just be aware that it can be quite sad. Opening up these conversations and encouraging your child to explore that kind of mental chatter with you is a really helpful thing to do, partly because you can say, I don't agree with that. These are all the reasons why I think that your brain is wrong and you deserve to be loved and cared for and you're beautiful and wonderful and brilliant. We can't help them with that if we don't actually know what's happening in their head, but it can be a little bit distressing and sad and upsetting to hear the stories that our children tell about themselves and to themselves. So that's all the more reason to want to change them, but just, I guess, trigger warning that it can feel, it can feel difficult as someone who really, really loves a child to hear how horrible they can be about themselves sometimes. So yeah, we want to change that. Okay. Just finally, again, back to that idea of all these things that we can do for our children. The most helpful thing for an anxious child is a calm adult. So we're going to take a deep breath and we're going to try and be there calmly by their side. This is a lot easier said than done because their anxiety will provoke our anxiety. These feelings are catching. But what we want to do, if we can, is to try and exercise enough self-care and learn about our own emotional regulation enough so that we can be that calm, in control, consistent, communicative adult that they need by their side, supporting them. We won't manage to do that all the time. And part of this is about us finding our own outlets and the people we can let off steam to and our ways of getting away from it all sometimes. But if we can do this some of the time, our children will really, really benefit. Okay, before we go to questions, and do be popping your questions into the chat, a few things you might want to follow up with. I will just share again in a moment a link to the blog post where you can download the slides, and there's links to other resources that I've referred to throughout. And do drop me a line if there's anything else that you would like. And it's on my blog as well. I'll make sure it's pinned at the top today. But a couple of things you might like here too. You might find my YouTube channel helpful. There's loads of anxiety hacks on there, and my anxiety handbook. So a couple of the ideas I shared today were inspired by this book in particular. It's really, really brilliant. It is not written for autistic children or those with ADHD specifically, but there's lots in there you could take away. It's from a series actually, which also includes other titles, for example, one on trauma. I think they're really great books. They're aimed at the children themselves, but particularly if you've got a child who finds it a little bit harder to comprehend things, then you might want to use the book alongside them, but I would really highly recommend it.